Feliz Sábado. Happy Sabbath. It's good to see you today. We're glad that you can come together for worship. Not a night goes by in my house when I am not there for bedtime that the kids want a bedtime story. Now, this is aside from their evening worship story, but in addition to that, they want a bedtime story. They love their stories in bed, and I think it started when I started doing that with Sophia at a very young age. In fact, there will be many nights where Sophia is quietly waiting for me to come home. And she hopes that I will enter her room so that possibly I could tell her a story. What makes a story is that there has to be conflict. It's not really a story without the characters experiencing some problem, some difficulty, some disappointment or danger, a problem, something bad as well as something good. I've tried telling a story of a little girl who goes to the park, she plays with a friend, comes back home, no conflict. And they say, "Daddy, that's it?" They're waiting for more. They're waiting for the trouble. They're waiting for the suspense in the story. But we can relate. A book or a story is not really interesting unless it has an element of suspense, unless there's a villain, a problem from which there is a good ending. And movie lovers out there, same thing, right? That there has to be a villain, a rival, a disappointment in the story, some conflict that brings about something good. And I want us to think about that. Conflict, trouble, pain, disappointment, these have all been part of the human experience since the entrance of sin. Since the entrance of sin into a once perfect world, and each and every one of us has experienced these things, haven't we? Disappointment, conflict, pain. Each and every one of us. The Bible tells us in the book of Romans that we know that all creation has been groaning as the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Quite frankly, beloved, humanity is tired. The world is tired. And that's what the Bible tells us, that there is an element of groaning, that all of creation groans and travails even up to now. Each and every one of us has experienced these things. That is why Revelation describes a time where this sin-sick world, that those who overcome, they will come through. And the Bible describes that there will be a period where there will be no more death. There will be no more sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away. And he says, "Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things" what? New. So the Bible tells us that there are those that at the end of time we are going to experience a time where there will be no more conflict, no more pain, no more suffering or sorrow. But up until then, it is our lot to struggle through these things. We are resuming today our study in the writings of John. We've been doing a series in the writings of John, or they call it the Johannine literature. And so we are in Revelation. The Gospel of John was written by the Apostle John. He also wrote the 3 letters or 3 epistles that you find before the book of Jude. And he also wrote the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation, we have a story or the narrative of the dangers and the conflict with which the church throughout history has faced. We're resuming our study in the writings of John here, particularly in Revelation, John was most likely the youngest of the apostles. He had a very special relationship with Jesus, did John. His heart was linked with that of the Savior, so much so that after the crucifixion of Jesus, it was to John that Jesus entrusted the care of his mother. And John would care for the mother of Jesus until her very last day. And so we're looking this morning at the gospel, you might say, found in the book of Revelation. If you have your Bible this morning, I invite you to take it and open to Revelation chapter 10. Revelation chapter 10. This particular chapter, or the incidents recorded here, fall as an interlude in between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet. There is an interlude period between those trumpets, and we're going to see where kind of this fits into historical time. But before we begin with Revelation chapter 10, it would be of importance to note that there is one book which the Bible has said had been closed or sealed up or shut away until a specific time. Only one book in the whole Bible. And it comes at the very conclusion of that particular book. As a prophet, Daniel was fulfilling or writing the prophecies revealed to him, it was told, it says in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4, "You, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even until the time of" what? "Until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall increase." And it says it again there in verse 9 of the same chapter, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words," or the prophecy, "are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." The New Living Translation says, "Keep this prophecy a secret until the time of the end." Another translation would say, "Close up these words until the time of the end." And so the prophecies in Daniel, particularly a prophecy that would come toward the end of time, was supposed to be, and he was commanded to, seal it or shut it away for a specific time. In other words, it could not be understood until a particular time. Now, with that in mind, let's pick up our reading in Revelation chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. Revelation chapter 10, we'll read the first 4 verses. We'll come back and look at these in detail. It says, "And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth, and he cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roars, and when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices." Verse 4, "And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, 'Seal up those things which the 7 thunders have uttered, and do not write them.'" Very interesting. Let's pick it up here. John sees in this vision a mighty angel. Now the question, my friends, is who is this mighty angel? Notice the description that is given of him there in verse 1. John describes him as clothed with a cloud, with a rainbow on his head, his face as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. Many scholars have come to agreement that this bright and mighty angel is none other than Jesus Christ himself. Notice the parallels that we see here. In other places where John has seen Jesus, he is described in a very similar way. And so if you can see that, in Acts chapter 1, he is received in a cloud. Where you also see that there is a rainbow that surrounds the throne in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 3. It's almost above and surrounds the throne. And who sits on the throne? God sits on the throne. Jesus says, I sit by the Father. He sits there. As we also see that there is his face in Revelation chapter 1. John sees Jesus, and his face shines, or his countenance shines brightly like the sun. And also he is seen depicted as feet, as fire, as fine brass that are burned in a furnace. These are descriptions of Jesus. So as John sees this mighty angel, it's no other than Jesus here approaching. But notice what it goes on to say, that this particular angel had something particularly that would be of interest to John. Notice what it says in verse 2. And he had in his hand a little book or a little scroll. And friends, what was the state or the condition of this book? The book was what? Opened. You have a book in the angel's hand, having been opened. He sets his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth. Here we have a little book or a scroll that was open in the hand of the angel. Some translations, and in the Greek it says having been opened, which lends to the understanding that this book was previously what? Closed. And now this takes place before John. Now, as John is about to engage this angel, or perhaps the contents of this book, the Bible tells us that when he cried with a loud voice, that 7 thunders uttered their voices. We don't know what those 7 thunders were. We don't even know what they said necessarily. But what we do know is that when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, John was going to take down and record what was spoken. Until a voice came from heaven that said, do not write those things that the thunders have said. What the thunders announced was to be something that would be known later, apparently. And John was going to record it, but then was commanded to seal that up and not to record. Now, what goes on to tell us here is that the gospel that we find, or the writing that we see here in Revelation chapter 10, records that the prophecies that would not be understood in the book of Daniel, particularly a prophecy that would point to the end of time, was now going to become unveiled or open and revealed to the church. And what is that exactly? Notice what it says in verse 5 of Revelation 10. The angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, and earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be time no longer. The New King James, some other translation may say that there would be no more delay, but the word there is used chronos, which is time. There should be no more time. What is this speaking about? Notice verse 7. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished. The mystery of God should be finished. What is the mystery of God? Evidently, what these thunders utter was some matters that pertain to the prophecy of Daniel that were not to be yet ours to know. And that this would be coming, that the sounding of the 7th angel would come at a time when the mystery of God should be finished. The mystery of God, my dear friends, simply put, is the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. But more intricately than that is that the gospel would be finished in the sense that it would be a revelation of the character of God among his people. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 9 says that to make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery which from the beginning of the world has been hid in God, who created all things by whom? Jesus Christ. In Colossians chapter 1, it says that God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And so the mystery encapsulates the gospel. That is to say, it is the mystery, the fact that the divine Son of God would come to earth as a human baby, that he would grow as a man, that he would take upon himself all of the limitations of humanity while still retaining divinity. It's a mystery. And then John experiences something here in Revelation chapter 10, that he is told to go and take the little book from the angel's hand. And do you recall what he was told to do with it? He was told, go and take the book from the angel's hand, take it and eat it. He says, and when you do, it will be bitter in your belly, but it will be sweet as honey in your mouth. Let me tell you something. It wasn't easy to be a prophet of God. The prophets of God, all through history, have had some very difficult things to do. The experience of John encapsulates, as it were, the experience that God's people will face at the time of the end. So John goes and he takes the book. Actually, the angel says, come here. He gives it to him. He says, eat it. And this is in vision here, but John eats the book. That would give you some indigestion, wouldn't it? He eats the book, and sure enough, it was sweet as honey in the mouth. But after he had swallowed and taken it down, it was a bitter experience. I think I can relate to what John must have felt. Many years ago, before Denny and I were married, my sister and I came home over break from college, and we had both brought our significant others home. And one morning after breakfast, my soon-to-be brother-in-law, or who would be my brother-in-law, decided we were going to go play tennis. I mean, the guy was soon to propose to my sister, so I had to beat him in tennis. You got to let him know what's up early. So we drove to a nearby park, and as I was pulling into the parking place, I began to feel this sharp pain in my stomach. And I didn't want to, let him know that something was going on, but I told him to go ahead, warm up, and that I would be right there. But I couldn't quite explain it. There was this burning, sour sensation in my stomach, and I had to recline my seat just to stretch my stomach. And I was, quite frankly, scared. I was like, what in the world is that? After a few minutes, I didn't want to look weird, so I got out of the car, and I felt, I guess, some temporary relief. But when I got out to the court, the tennis court, there I began to feel the sharpness of this burning once again, and I couldn't even, unsheath my tennis racket out of its case. I was bent over, and then, in just a few moments, I began to see that my brother-in-law was experiencing something similar. He also began to oh man. And friends, in a couple of minutes, imagine this, 2 grown guys are on the ground of tennis courts, and we were writhing in pain. I imagine what people driving by must have thought. What happened? Well, after a few minutes, finally we settled down, drank some water. My mom has always, ever since I was young, has always given us, my sister and I, vitamins after breakfast. And I don't know what all she gives me. Every vitamin of A through Z, everything's in there. And, we never really questioned, and we would always take our vitamins. But in this particular day, she put cayenne pepper capsules. What does cayenne pepper do? And so in the mix of those vitamins, she had given each of us cayenne pepper capsules. And boy, did they make themselves known. I can experience, I might be able to relate to what John must have felt when he passed down that little book. The mystery of God would be finished. John would take the book, and it was an experience of sweetness in the mouth, but it would be bitter, oh so bitter, in the stomach. This picture that you see in front of you is known as Ascension Rock. I would like to go visit there one day, but it's where the Advent believers gathered around one morning in October of 1844, because there had been a movement that had swelled in New England and in many parts of the country and around the world, prophecies that were read and understood that Jesus was soon to come. And they had calculated the dates, specifically in a prophecy in Daniel chapter 8, that unto 2,300 days the sanctuary would be cleansed. And this experience led to people giving their hearts to God, conversions being made all around, and people sincerely and genuinely believing that Jesus was soon to come. Many of the people there sold their farms or neglected to harvest their crops because, after all, Jesus was soon to come. And it was a sweet experience as the believers gathered expecting Jesus to come. But as that day came and went in 1844, and Jesus did not come, there was a bitter disappointment in the gut of the believers. John experiences here what would be prophesied to be encapsulated and felt by his people, God's people, near the end of time. And beloved, this disappointment was a very real disappointment. These were men and women with their heart and soul trusting, because the Word of God had apparently taught that Jesus Christ was going to come, and everything was primed and ready for Him to come. These were men and women who are our spiritual forebears. And they experienced the things of disappointment unlike perhaps what have not been felt before. One of them had even said that the morning after, when they had wept and wept, their hopes were dashed, their expectations were crushed, and they had hoped, longed for the coming of the Messiah, only to be disappointed. He says, we wept and wept till the day dawned. This is an experience that the pioneers, the early Adventist pioneers, had gone through. How many of you, I'm curious, can name at least 3 of the people pictured here? If you can name at least 3, very good. How many can name at least 4? How many can name all of them? All of them. Pastors don't count, by the way. Hey, if you can, I've got a prize for you after the service. These were men and women, real men and women. But the thing that distinguished this disappointment, while many had returned back to their old churches, many had given up faith altogether, there was a group of believers that came back to Scripture and studied. They knew that out of the disappointment, God was preparing them for something great. Notice what it says in Revelation 10 and picking up in verse 10. Revelation 10 and verse 10 says, "And I took the little book out of the angel's hand, and I ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And he said to me, you must prophesy" what? Again, before many peoples, nations, and tongues, and peoples. And so what was announced as there would be time no longer, this is not the end of historical time, that this would be the end of prophetic time. There would be no more time prophecies. But the day, he says, you must prophesy again before many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. And friends, we see that phrase appear again in Revelation chapter 14 for the three angels' messages. They would go before peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. But here was my question as I studied this. Why did God predict the disappointment? Why did God predict and have John act out a disappointment? What was the purpose for that? You see, God delights to show the future. God delights in revealing the future as a way to protect His children so that they would know, so that nothing would catch them by what? Surprise. But why would God shield the disappointment but yet predict that there would be a bitter experience followed by a sweet one? You see, my dear friends, there are times in life that we experience disappointments where our mind does not understand, but our heart can still choose to trust. You will go through disappointments in this life, and your mind does not understand, but your heart can still trust. And it is through those disappointments, that perseverance and that testing, that God is refining and preparing His children. Why do we experience disappointment? You know, we experience disappointment in relationships, perhaps on the job, in the hopes that something would come. But let's be honest, you experience disappointment because we've had expectations for something, right? So we expect something, or we are hoping for something, and when it doesn't come out, or the results are not as the way we expected, we are disappointed. Raise your hand if you have never been disappointed in your life here. We all have, haven't we? We've all been disappointed because we've had hopes, we've had expectations for something, and those expectations are not met. Those hopes are crushed, and disappointment sets in. And so what happens now is that humanity has a way of trying to kind of preserve or protect its heart, and so often we will not invest emotionally anymore because we don't want the possibility of being disappointed. And so there is so often little engagement, investment emotionally, because it's a way of shielding and protecting a possible disappointment. Perhaps there's some here who have been disappointed in a marriage relationship. It wasn't what you expected it would be. You had the promise and the hopes, of bliss, but it wasn't in that marriage relationship what you expected it to be. Perhaps there are some here who have experienced disappointment in relationships with friends. You have been let down. There are some here, perhaps, who have experienced disappointment because of the choices that our children have made. And because of your hopes for them, because of your aspirations and expectations, we have been met with disappointment when they are not met. Perhaps there may be somebody here today who feels that God has disappointed them. You were praying for a certain outcome. You were hoping that something would be answered a certain way, and it was not. And you struggle with disappointment, and you feel as if God didn't come through. We struggle with disappointment. But the good news, my dear friends, in all of this is that through the disappointment, God brings in rays of hope. Through the disappointment, through the loss or the pain, Christ Himself suffers it with us. The disappointment that came to the Advent believers was not totally unsimilar to what was felt in the first century in the early Christian church, when they had hoped that Christ would set up the kingdom. that they had hoped that he would be coronated as king over Israel and obliterate the Roman power, only to see their Lord and Master taken to the cross. Disappointment. But out of the ashes of that disappointment, God would raise up his church and move them forward. My dear friends, we experience disappointment. We suffer the things that sometimes our mind doesn't understand, but we can be in a position where our heart can still trust. Pat Tillman was a former NFL star for the Arizona Cardinals. After the events of September 11, 2001, Pat Tillman joined the U.S. Army to come in defense of his country. He had even turned down a $3.6 million contract. Pat Tillman refused any media requests to cover his enlistment. He refused the media to cover his basic training or their deployment. He wanted to be treated like any other soldier. He didn't want any special attention. Think of it, a successful football player, really on the prime of his career, and he left his career. He would leave his new wife, he would leave his home, and he was sent to Afghanistan. One night in April 2004, while serving in Afghanistan, his unit was ambushed by insurgents as they were heading into this narrow, steep canyon. While attempting to come to the defense of his patrol, Tillman was shot and killed. It was determined that he had been shot by his own platoon. Of course, it was put on the news as perhaps one of the most historic friendly fire casualties in the history of the military of this country. But here we have one who had left home, who had left security, who had left millions to go and to serve, to go to a foreign place, and there eventually he would be killed in friendly fire. My friends, the Son of God was killed by friendly fire, by the very people that he came to save. He left his throne, he left the presence of his Father and of the holy angels, he left his home, and he came to a fallen world. And it was here that the God-man would suffer everything that fallen human race could throw at him. The Lord himself, heaven would have experienced the greatest loss. The angels would have been just ready to be deployed to the Son of God's rescue, but the Father had to wave them back because he was on a mission to rescue you and me from this world. We go through disappointments, but the disappointments that we may face today should remind us that while the mind does not understand, the heart can still trust. Jesus Christ is the foundation of his church. And even though we may experience things on this world that we cannot have perfect clarity of understanding, we can still choose to trust with the knowledge that one day everything will be made known. Is that your desire today? To put your trust even when you may not fully understand. I'm going to invite you to stand together if that is your desire as we close with our closing song, "The Church